After the discovery of the palace of Mycenae and of the ruins of Troy, the possibility that the Iliad might be based on actual historical events grew more and more believable. But as time and archaeology went on, the similarities between the Mycenaean and Homeric world began to fade, hinting to the possibility that the Greeks had suddenly and almost mysteriously forgotten their own Bronze Age past a few generations after the collapse. That Homer, if he really existed, made everything up inspired by what remained of their ancestors. In the Iliad, although Lesbos, the Mysians, Carians, Cilicians, and Lycians are also present in Hittite sources, we find no mention of the existence of Arzawa, Tarhun Tassa, Seha, and of the Hittites themselves. Moreover, the Greeks seem to have completely erased Linear B from their folk memory soon after the end of their own Bronze Age phase. They forgot how to read those symbols entirely, and they hadn't even used them to write poetry, or anything that could fulfill Schliemann hopes. They used them for economic and administrative purposes. It's true that Olympians were surely worshipped by the Achaeans, and that in both Linear B and Hittite texts, Greek names such as Alexander, Achilles, Eteocles, perhaps Atreus have been found, but most of them are likely not referring to the heroes we find in the poems. The classical scholar Moses Finley explains this in his book The World of Odysseus. How little today remains of Homer as a witness of the world in which, according to the traditional opinion, the Trojan War should have happened. It would be almost sufficient to compare the long and relatively optimistic list of Homeric Mycenaean parallelisms that can be found in Helda Lorimer's book Homer and the Monuments, published in 1950, with a miserable half-dozen, more or less, that survived when Kirk's book The Songs of Homer appeared in 1962. Since then, the Homeric palace and the Homeric chariot have been thrown into the sea, together with their equipment, and at the end of the hardest blow all, the surrender of the last bastion. Chadwick's Mycenaean Geography. Franco Montanari also states in his introduction to Homer that, regarding the coincidences between Homeric geography and the Mycenaean one, many steps back have been made to underline the differences instead. An exotic and fascinating solution to this problem has been created by the Italian engineer Felice Vinci. It's true that his title already shows he was not a professional historian in the slightest. Nevertheless, this didn't stop him from being a passionate reader of ancient literature and a person who knew Greek very well. After reading and studying in depth the Iliad and the Odyssey, he came up with a seemingly insane solution. The poems are not set in Greece, but in the Baltic. The ancestors of the Greeks used to live in northern Europe in the early Bronze Age, but then migrated south due to climate shifts and brought their toponyms with them. This would also place the Trojan War centuries before what we have already assumed. This is all written in his book The Baltic Origins of Homer's Epic Tales. In Italian, Omero il Baltico. Sadly, the evidence for this claim is very scarce and mostly based on modern notations of which we don't even know the true name before they were written down. But still, although the chance of it being true is not so high, it's still very intriguing and not exactly zero either, and a video on this topic is surely worth the effort. Even the Italian scholar Rosa Cazzecchi Onesti, renowned for publishing a detailed translation of the Iliad, was greatly surprised by his book and considered the possibility that Vinci might have been right, no matter how small it could have been, especially after she had visited Ireland. In the introduction to the third edition of his book, she states, even after the publication of the book, he, in fact, continued to find and has found other reasons on which to base his beliefs, so much so that this reprint of his book comes out enriched with new proofs of which he informed me. And I have to say that the impressions received in a recent trip of mine in Ireland have made me find his hypothesis even more convincing. Now, back to the book itself. The most compelling yet outlandish evidence lies in geography. Since antiquity, Homeric geography has been causing huge problems because of its contradictory nature when compared to the real locations the poems are believed to be set in. The historian Strabo notices a weird detail in Book 4 of the Odyssey. Why did Homer state that the island of Pharos, despite being right in front of Egypt, is a day's sail off by ship? Moreover, Ithaca is described as the westernmost island of the Ionian Islands, which allegedly include the mysterious Dulichion, sorry for a atrocious pronunciation, Stame, also known as Samos and Zakynthos, whereas in reality this is pretty much the opposite. Odysseus Island is east of Kefalonia, the biggest island of the archipelago, and right in the middle of it. Also, where is the island of Dulichion supposed to be located? It was clearly the biggest island, since half of the pretenders to Ithaca's throne came from there. Despite being mentioned various times, we can't point at it on a map with certainty. What is quite certain, however, is that its name is related to a Greek word meaning long. If not in the Mediterranean, where could we find one of the best candidates? Maybe in the faraway Baltic Sea, Vinci suggests. Here we find an island literally called Long Island, Langeland. Surprising claims about the location of similar places are also given in Plutarch's book, on the face that appears on the orb of the moon. He places Ogygia, the island of Odysseus stayed in for 7 years, not in the Aegean Sea, but at 5 days of navigation from Britain westwards. Roughly the distance one had to cover to reach the Faroe Islands. It is possible that these icy rocks were Calypso's home. By analyzing the original text, we also spot matching environmental descriptions. Many of the birds mentioned in the Odyssey as calling these islands home, such as owls, falcons, and crows, fit perfectly in an northern European setting, together with the deep caves on the coasts and the conifer trees. We must also remember Atlas, Calypso's father, and what else is named after Atlas, the Atlantic Sea. There is even a small island named Kalsoi, and a mountain named, sorry for pronunciation, Ogoj. I have no idea. In the same archipelago. Speaking of the Odyssey, the land Homer never actually refers to it as an island. Inhabited by the Phaeacians is also referred to not just as Phaeacia, but also as Scheria. It's worth noting that in Old Norse, Scheria means rift, which are very common on the western coast of Norway, especially in the places such as the Bergen area. And considering that Scheria had a lot of cliffs and basically no true beaches, the hypothesis becomes more believable. Scheria is said to be close to the lands of giants and cyclopses, and in Norse mythology, giants are called trolls, and they live in the north of Scandinavia. When talking about the north, the Phaeacians claim to theoretically come from there, more specifically from Hyperei, but that they were later forced to migrate by what Vinci considers trolls. Now, we must not take this account literally. It might simply mean that they migrated south as the temperatures were getting colder because of the end of the warm post-glacial period. Now back to Denmark. If Langeland is really supposed to be Dulichion, the northern nearby South Sionan Islands, not to be confused with the much bigger ones around, could potentially be what most interpret as the Ionian Island. Posinge can be identified as the Zakynthos because of the similar name, Euro as Samos and Luo as Ithaca, one of the westernmost islands of the region, if we exactly follow Homer's indications. Vinci believes that Luo matches Ithaca in both location and geographical description. On the island there is a dolmen called the Crow Rock, and a similar object is described near the palace where the character Eumeus lived in. And here, amongst this group of islands, we can also identify the little the little rock of Avernaco, in Greek Asteris, in the strait between Ithaca and Same, where Penelope's suitors tried to waylay Telemachus. East of Langeland, we find a larger and flat island, Svealand, also known as Zealand. Since it's right next to the places previously mentioned and also very large in comparison, Vinci believed that it was supposed to be the Peloponnese. Part of the evidence is in the name. It literally translates to Pelops Island, but in reality, what we today call Peloponnese is a peninsula, since it's connected to the mainland through the city of Corinth, in contrast to two islands such as Zealand itself. In addition, Vinci points out that in the Odyssey, it's not a very mountainous region. Instead, it's covered in large plains and heavily influenced by the wind blowing from the west, and so is Zealand. We even have details regarding Telemachus' journey from Pylos to Lacedaemon across a wheat-producing plain. Menelaus is even called ruler of the wide plain. Now let's leave the land and cross the sea, more specifically, the Hellespont. In our world, the Hellespont is the narrow strait that connects the Aegean to the Sea of Marmara, but in the Iliad, it's described as wide or even endless. This is what led some, such as Finley himself, to find the archaeological site of Hisarlik suspicious, mainly because the two rivers that allegedly meet near Troy, the Scamander and Simois, are actually very distant from the city and don't even meet at any point. But modern scholars are not the only ones to come up with this idea. The geographer Strabo, in his Geography, stated on Hisarlik, "The ancient Ilion is not here." Standing as solid ground for his hot take is the presence of a large plain in Troy where the heroes fought, but in reality it did exist during the Bronze Age, as Strabo already knew, because it had not been created by the river sediments yet. In Vinci's point of view, this problem can be resolved by placing Troy in Finland, more specifically, where today we find a familiar sounding village, Toija, halfway between Helsinki and Turku, which he himself had visited in 1992. This place shares many similarities with Priam city. The terrain surrounding the coastal plain is hilly, and from there the river Kulkelanjoki descends towards the sea, becoming wider and wider, creating at some point a small lake in the middle of the plain, the Kirkojärvi, in which the creek Mammalajonki also descends. Then the Kirkojärvi again turns into another river, the Kiskonjoki, and flows towards the sea. It's also interesting how a nearby river, the Halikonjoki, literally the Haliko River, shares pretty much the same name as the Halikos River in southwestern Sicily. A few kilometers south, we stumble across the town of Ayala. And why is it important, you might ask? Well, as we have already stated, if we start from the assumption that the Greeks used to live in Scandinavia, then finding cues in the Greek language itself helps. The closest sounding word is Aigialos, which, other than being the name of an ally of the Trojans, also means beach or shore. It's possible, according to Vinci, that the coastline used to be much farther inland in the past, and that Ayala used to be a location on the sea, but due to the soil emergence that started at the end of the last ice age, and continues to this day, the beach is now gone. Absolutely worth noting is that Homer himself calls Aigialos the coast where the Achaeans had landed in Book 14, not to mention that the ships used by the Achaeans themselves had masts that were routinely demounted and mounted again, which was a common practice among the Vikings. Taking all of this into account, the White Sea described by Homer could reasonably be argued to be the Gulf of Finland, and it's in the proximity of this true Hellespont that we find eerily numerous locations that are too similar to the ones of both peoples and characters of the Iliad in name to be mere coincidence. Caria reminds us of the Carians, Nasty of the Nastes, their king, Kikoinen of the Siconians, Reso of the Thracian king Resos, Loki of the Lycians, Tesla of Tenedos, Padva of Padua, allegedly founded by the Trojan Antenor, Tantala of the king Tantalus, Sifla of Siplos, the place where he was buried, and many other places. If we take a look at the Norwegian coast, the sirens and dangerous waters and whirlpools caused by Scylla and Charybdis in the Odyssey were all off the coast of the Lofoten Islands, where the same phenomena happen today. Yeah, in Vinci's mind, the Homeric Sicily was actually the frozen wasteland of Nordland in northern Norway, and south of it lived the Laestrygonians. Churches Island is also somewhere in the country of Troms, and Aeolus' home is in the Shetlands, and so on and so on. The coincidences also extend across the rest of the Baltic. The Bay of Norrtälje, 70 kilometers north of Stockholm, could be what Homer calls the Anomalies, from where the Achaean fleet sailed towards Troy, and today the sea between Toya and Norrtälje is also crossed by ferryboats. In the nearby Åland Islands, we find the Lemland, whose name sounds like Lemnos, and this is where the hero Philoctetes was abandoned. By this logic, the Gulf of Bothnia is nothing but a northern Aegean in the Thracian Sea, and Thrace therefore was actually the northern coast of Sweden. If we follow the catalogue of ships in a Baltic light, let's say, it becomes easier to locate the potential locations of Homeric places and regions. Boeotia is the region that includes Stockholm today. Eubea coincides with Åland. The mythological Athens is located in the territory of the modern Karlskrona in southern Sweden, in a region full of rivers, just like what Plato said in his dialogue Critias. Arcadia, Pylos, and Agamemnon's territory, including Mycenae, allegedly in the Peloponnese, are thus placed in Zealand. The island of Moon in the southeast is the rocky island of Cranae, where Priam and Helen Priam and Helen chose for their first meeting after escaping Sparta. Pyrene could be Plön in northern Germany, not far away from Jutland. On Heligoland we found Helike, sanctuary of Poseidon. Don't worry, it gets way weirder. In some Viking sagas, Odin is described as coming from Asia, and Snorri's Edda states that the place where Thor dwells, Thrudheimr, is actually Thrace. The vast land of Crete, home to 100 cities, is actually Pomerania. This explains why in Mycenean art there is little content connected to Greek mythology. As if we couldn't get to more outlandish than this, the Pelasgians, name given to various Indo-European populations in Greece that had survived the initial Greek migration when to the historical period, were actually connected to the Polish language. No wonder Polska sounds similar. Speaking of Poland, did you know Poland is actually Egypt? The Vistula is in the Nile, at least according to Vinci, which is further proven by the fact that the name Egypt, in Greek Aegyptos, sounds similar to the name of the Germanic tribe of the Gepids, which lived in the area until the 3rd century AD. This explains why the Iliad text places Thebes on the coast. It coincides with the coastal town of Thezeu, and further away from it lies the island of Faroe, maybe Pharos itself, at a day of distance from the coast, just like what Homer stated. On the border between Latvia and Russia, maybe lies the Phthia, home of Achilles. You also find in the Botnian Gulf the settlement of Yolka, which reminds us of Iolcus, Jason's homeland. Way farther north we reach Hades in modern-day Karelia. There is also an identified island called Ortygia, more or less, next to the island of Syrie, home of Eumeus, both located where the sun sets. Ortyx, meaning quail, is also the animal Asteria, Latona's sister, turned into before dying, and Diodorus Siculus stated in his Historical Library Book 2 that beyond the lands of the Celts there is an island not smaller than Sicily, where Latona was born, and that on it they allegedly worshipped Apollo more than the other gods. Mycenean traces left in southern England and near Stonehenge seem to suggest that Ortygia might have been Britain. Syrie might possibly be related to the name of the Suir River, the modern-day Lee. There are way other locations and anomalies to talk about, but I think I have said enough, and I can't make my video too long. You are probably thinking, how could this be possible? Isn't the setting of the Iliad supposed to be the Mediterranean, no matter how inaccurate it is? Well, in theory, yes, but we also find various out-of-place anomalies, not just in geography. In the Iliad, the weather of the Troad is very foggy, and Odysseus' sea appears to be very misty and breezy, full of storms. Bad weather is very common, despite being a seemingly Mediterranean setting, with tons of snow, cold, rain and wind, sometimes even in the plains. The soldiers are even forced to pray so that the sun might show up during battles. They always wear thick clothes, especially furry mantles, that they keep even during feasts. The Baltic theory also explains why the battles in the poems don't stop with the sunset and often continue during the night. And it's thanks to the long days and basically non-existent nights during the summer that Patroclus' troops were able to fight until the next day. We follow Vinci's timeline. The events of the poems in reality took place during a phase of high temperature in northern Europe, which reached its peak in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC and began to cool down after the year 2000 BC. The worsening climate forced the Proto-Greeks to migrate south and settle in Greece, thus founding the Mycenean civilization. What makes the book so innovative is the idea of placing the Iliad in a historical setting, predating what the traditional opinion has been claiming in the last centuries. The connection between the Achaeans, and yes, this is not a pseudo-historical way to refer to the erroneously named Mycenaeans, since this name is also attested in Hittite sources, and Northern Europe is highlighted by Professor Martin Linson in his book Homer and Mycenae, who wrote about the huge amount of Baltic amber in the earliest tombs, which however is very scarce in the most recent ones. Moreover, many buildings such as the Megaron bear incredible resemblance to the palaces of Scandinavian kings, and the similarity between the stone tablets of Dendra and the Central European menhirs is striking. Blonde hair is very common in Northern Europe, and it's also a characteristic of the Achaeans across Greek literature, with Pindarus' Nemean Ode mentioning the blonde Danaans. Also, what about the word Danaan itself? In ancient Celtic legend, the Tuatha De Danann, the tribe of the goddess Dana, were the original inhabitants of Ireland. No wonder if Homer's heroes appear barbaric compared to the already established civilizations of the ancient Middle East and Anatolia. They were descendants of invaders. The video does not contain all the information in the book, just a slice of it. The original work dwells deeper into each point, even goes as far as to explain the most conspiracy-esque theories. I have no clue whether anything that he says has a chance of being true, but I, to be honest, really hope so. If this is even proven to be true, it would be a breath of fresh air in a world where historical or scientific knowledge is often treated as dogma rather than actual knowledge. Thank you for your attention.